but hopefully you'll see some of the benefits of those efforts when you see those results today and you get a flavour of where your Parliament sits vis-à-vis the others across OECD countries. Just a little bit of background first on the survey. So we have run this twice before. We ran it in 2011 and 2018. But this is the first time that we've framed it around our best practices for parliamentary budget oversight, which were published a couple of years ago. And what that means is that we've brought together some new themes into the survey that weren't previously there. And in particular, we've also brought questions from other surveys that we did into this parliamentary survey so that it's a more rounded and comprehensive picture of Parliament's role in the budget process. New themes that we've brought in particular include themes around citizen participation in the budget process, as well as the Parliament's role in debating and approving the overall fiscal framework. I mentioned the OECD best practices for parliaments in budgeting. That was indeed the rubric, the framework that helped us map the questions for this survey. Just a reminder, there's 18 best practices set under these 8 headings, and so those were the headings in the survey. Going through each of these one by one, I just want to take you through some of the headline findings. So first of all, looking at the extent to which Parliament actually has a meaningful role in debating and approving the fiscal framework. This was a real area of strength in OECD countries, with the majority of legislators having a meaningful role debating and approving changes to the fiscal framework. This might include, for example, changes to the roles and responsibilities of your own institutions. It might include changes to the fiscal rules. I think the most prominent example in the minds of many people around this table will be the recent changes that were approved as part of the revisions to the EU fiscal framework, which will result in updating national legislation that will be approved in your own countries in the EU. The other thing we looked at is the extent to which legislators are actually engaged in debating budget priorities at the start of the year. Now, this is quite important because historically, parliaments have had a more limited role, specifically in the budget approval phase. But something that we've seen over recent years is that parliaments are getting a much more year-round role in budget scrutiny. And so we're pleased to see that now 2/3 of OECD parliaments actually have a role in viewing, debating, or approving overall fiscal priorities at the start of the budget process. One of the most prominent ones is Sweden, where the parliament actually votes on budget totals and votes on fiscal priorities for the medium term ahead of the annual budget being presented. Okay, so the other thing which we asked about was, in this section, was the extent to which parliaments are involved with looking at long-term fiscal sustainability. And this is a new question that we asked. What's interesting here is we saw that the long-term fiscal sustainability reports are often tabled, but actually there's limited role for these beyond being submitted. And I think that's something that we'd like to see more of in coming years, is the role of parliaments formally in relation to these reports growing. And in particularly at the moment, we see just 9 OECD parliaments have a formal debate of these long-term fiscal sustainability reports. But given the fiscal context that we're in, given the historically high levels of debt, the very constrained fiscal environment that many OECD countries are in, I think this is something that we would like to see Parliament having a more active role in the years to come. I'll just sing, will I? While I'm waiting. No, don't worry. The slides will resume in a second and I'll carry on. Do you know any songs, Paula? Yeah. Oh, it's back. Would you like me to do a Highland fling while you wait? Okay, I'll come and do a Highland fling to detract.
This is the entire reason for the Chatham House rule.
Unfortunately, I didn't bring my bagpipes, or else I could follow up with.
Well, I was thinking that if anyone wants to make an intervention, you're welcome to bring forth the
national
dance of your country.
How's your line dancing, Eddie? How's your line dancing?
Ireland does have a brush dance, but I couldn't find a brush in time.
What's that? Okay, I've been advised to carry on without the slides. For now. Okay, so the next part of the survey essentially looked at budget approval powers of the legislature and the extent to which the budget has a role in shaping the actual contents of the budget. And indeed, what we found is the vast majority of legislators do have a significant role in amending the budget. And in particular, most OECD countries can amend the budget at least within limits that restrict overall budget totals. And it's very unusual to see very restricted amendment powers. This is, of course, in line with OECD best practices. We also looked at what happens to budgets when they're not approved before the start of the budget year. And in the majority of OECD countries, what actually happens is the budget from the previous year then continues. Although in some OECD countries, for example, it might be a different situation, like a government shutdown or some other situation. One of the interesting things for us to consider is whether in these sorts of circumstances there is enough of incentive for governments to actually approve the budget in any budget year, particularly in circumstances where large coalitions are coming together at the moment from different parts of the political spectrum and are finding it particularly difficult to get agreement on the annual budget. And there's some OECD countries now where we have seen the budget from previous years rolled forward for now multiple years. And the question arises of whether the government will actually be able to table its own budget in its political term. We also looked at the extent to which government has a role in looking at or having an influence on how the budget is implemented. And what do I mean here specifically? What I mean is whether the Parliament actually has a role approving supplementary budgets. And what we tend to see is that yes, 3 out of 4 OECD legislatures have supplementary budgets submitted to them, and half of these must get legislative approval. But I think what's really key here is understanding the terms of supplementary budgets being submitted to the Parliament and the terms under which approval must be sought, because really that's what gives meaning to the process. And what we find is that in some countries, it might be that the threshold for a supplementary budget coming to Parliament and actually being approved perhaps gives the government a larger degree of flexibility than in some other countries. And this can obviously result in some political gimmickry. Next, we looked at committee organization. Now, the main model of committee setup that we see by far is that there's a strong budget committee that looks at the overall budget totals and takes input from the sectoral committees in relation to spending in their areas. And then the budget committee creates a consolidated perspective from Parliament that is then debated and approved. And what we see is that these budget committees largely are using performance information as part of that process. And so that's a real positive in what we're seeing in OECD countries. One of the things that isn't so positive is that although the OECD best practices suggest that it's good to have an opposition-led finance chair, that's still not yet common practice across OECD countries. We also looked at analytical support and the technical muscle that parliaments have in order to debate the budget. And that's something that's obviously been core to discussions here in Chile at Congress. Now, one of the things that's interesting to us is that we have, over the years, seen the growth in the number of parliamentary budget offices supporting scrutiny at parliaments. And that brings us to the situation where we now have specialists across a number of different areas in Parliament supporting budget scrutiny. So we see on average there's around 12 budget specialists supporting scrutiny in OECD countries, but that range is actually very high, and it goes from none in some OECD countries to as many as 450 in the US. So there's still scope for, I guess, some sort of consistent technical support across the different parliaments in OECD countries. Now, one of the new areas we looked at in the survey was citizen engagement. And while the vast majority of legislators have their committee meetings open to the public, just 4 OECD countries are actually actively engaging in outreach activities in order to bring people in to the budget process. One of the most famous examples is, of course, from the Netherlands with the V100 initiative, which uses a panel of citizens that look at the end-year report of the government and suggest questions for parliamentarians to ask the government. And it's a great example of how you can really develop fiscal literacy among the citizens and at the same time bring the citizens into the process in a way that they feel engaged and also meaningfully involved. The next part of the survey that we looked at was AI and the use of AI in budget scrutiny. So there was actually very few examples from OECD countries where AI is beginning to be used, but I thought I would list those to you because they are quite interesting. So France, for example, is using AI to process amendments that are coming through and automatically distribute them to the relevant analyst according to the topic and the subject. So AI is essentially being used to optimize internal procedures and improve workflow efficiency. Similarly, in Italy, it's an objective to improve efficiency where AI is being used to help synthesize the legislative texts and help staff understand some of the complexity within those legislative texts. The US was actually an example of a country where AI is more prominently used. One of the interesting ways in which they use it is to compare current law with proposed amendments so that there's increased transparency and accuracy over the changes that are actually being proposed. There's also something called a congressional hackathon, which brings together developers with the House leadership, and they look at the ways in which prototype AI tools could be used to improve congressional operations. And one of the, outcomes of these hackathons in recent years has been the introduction of new budget dashboards, as well as AI-powered alerts for legislative changes. So to summarize from the survey, what we'll see is that legislators now play a strong role throughout the year in the budget cycle, in particularly approving the fiscal framework and changes to the annual budget. In other positive areas, they're actively engaging with performance information, and they're getting expert analytical support. And actually, one of the things that I didn't tell you was that they are increasingly calling on expert testimony, particularly from non-government stakeholders. However, there are still opportunities for Parliament scrutiny to engage. In particular, there's opportunities for Parliament to shine a greater spotlight on these long-term fiscal sustainability reports that are being tabled in Parliament, particularly given the fiscal context. There's also more of a need for a focus on citizen engagement and how that could be improved, given Parliament and its direct connection with citizens. I think this is the natural home for citizen engagement in the budget process, and what would be great to see is Parliament's playing a more active outreach role that involves not just hearing views from citizens, but involves a two-way dialogue where citizens are also more informed about the budget situation, which puts them in provides a shared understanding of the fiscal challenges and enables a common focus for the discussion amongst citizens and lawmakers. Finally, we're seeing that AI is offering new tools for workflow efficiency, real-time analysis, and also improved insights and transparency on legislative amendments and changes that might not otherwise be caught in what is often a very busy and challenging time for the legislature. I also want to tell you about what we're planning to do with this data next. So we have the OECD best practices for parliaments in budgeting, and that sets out across 8 areas what we see as kind of good standards and practices. And what we're planning on doing with the data is making an index of parliaments in budgeting, which has 4 pillars. The first pillar looking at the extent to which Parliament has a role in debating and approving the fiscal framework. The second, looking at the extent to which Parliament has amendment powers and the ability to influence budget approval. The third, looking at the role of Parliament in the implementation phase as well as the ex post audit phase of the budget. And then lastly, the supports that Parliament faces, or Parliament has in undertaking its budget scrutiny when it comes to the way the committee is set up, for example, the extent to which it engages with citizens, and also the technical support it has. So these are the 4 pillars that we will be looking at developing an index from, and we'll be in touch with you in coming weeks with the draft of this index, and we'll look forward to your comments on that groundbreaking development. So what are the next steps? Well, the information I presented to you today still needs to be formally validated internally, and it might be that when we're doing that, we come across some inconsistencies or anomalies, so we may well be in touch with you over coming weeks in what we call our data cleaning phase of the survey. We'll obviously be developing the index, as I spoke about, and hopefully we will then be using all of this information to have a new publication on parliamentary budgeting in OECD countries. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Cherie. You want to stay there at the podium for the
I'd love to.
questions?
Yeah.
Please raise your table tents or wave a hand, and I will call on you in the order in which you raise them, or at least I'll try to. Eddie from the OECD.
I just want to ask about the dancing. I was wondering about the hackathon. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I don't know anything about it, but what do they actually end up doing? Is it just a load of people get together and then they try to use AI, or what does it look like?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the congressional hackathon, and then actually turn it over to Julie to talk about the codathon that CBO does. So the congressional hackathon pulls together AI experts and other types of computer scientists to help with various problems with the way the legislature communicates with itself. So, so much of what you can get publicly is on the congress.gov website, and a lot of the improvements over the years have come from that hackathon. And it's an intense intense focus during August, because that's a time when staff have more time because the members are typically gone. Julie, do you want to speak to the codathon?
Sure. So 2 years ago, we started a codathon at CBO, and it sort of has dual purposes. So one is to get staff from different parts of the agency working together. So it's a good way of sort of building morale and collaboration. But people have come up with some really interesting projects. So the goal is that people are in teams of 3 or 4. They're typically are young analysts who come in with these excellent computer skills and can do things that I can't. And so we give each team a project, and they work on that project for the course of an entire week. So one example to highlight, so each year we have to put together a report on expiring and expired authorizations. And sort of gathering the information for this report is very, very labor intensive if one is to do it, because you're reading legislation for any sort of mention of authorizations or appropriations and dollar numbers and things like that. And so they made a lot of progress toward developing an AI tool to make this process much more automated. Now, we're not quite all the way there yet. It turns out it's really complicated, and there's such a variety of phrasing that can be used in the documents that it's difficult to sort of put together a set of rules. But just having that week set aside for these types of projects has sort of really pushed them along and helped us identify future projects. We have another one coming up this August, and so we're in the process of now soliciting ideas for the type of project that can be achieved in a week by non-expert people with sort of coaching from our more experienced analysts.
Terrific. So Turkey and then the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mark. What I'm going to ask to Sherry is that you mentioned that only a few countries is using AI in the budget processes. So is OECD planning to publish a document to promote the usage of AI in the coming years, or how we can use it in this process?
So actually, the OECD is working with a number of countries at the moment on improving the use of AI during the budget process. For the large part, where we see its real added value is in financial reporting and budget transparency on the government side. But we're seeing that it's still underutilized on the Parliament side. I have seen a couple of publications by other institutions, which I will not name, which start to look at how OECD parliaments and how parliaments can increasingly use AI. I have to say, for the most part, it's around productivity enhancements and aspects like that. But my own country, Scotland, which is not included in the survey because it's not an OECD member, I know that analysts in the library are using, for example, bots to update the GDP briefing that they give to members on a monthly basis. So the new figures are put into the bot, and the bot spits out the GDP briefing to the members. And I think there's lots of ways in which bots and AI and technology can be used to really improve productivity. But I think what I would like to see is more examples of OECD countries testing that out, which we could then showcase, I think, in a publication maybe in coming years. But I feel like I want more examples to be able to draw on before publishing something in that area.
United Kingdom.
Thank you. I've got a question about citizen participation. My perception of this is that to do it right it's quite resource intensive, can take quite a lot of time. In the UK context, we have relatively limited resource, and also the timings we face between budget information being released and approved is really very tight. I was wondering if you had any examples, or if others in the room had any examples of relatively kind of light touch citizen participation that doesn't require a huge amount of resource being devoted to it. That would be potentially a kind of a good place to start.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to that, because I think on the positive side, we've got social media now, right, and a lot of technology tools which enable you to scale up citizen engagement in a way that wasn't previously possible. So I think that's a real positive in terms of looking at new ways to engage with citizens as a parliament. But I think you have to highlight the risks as well in terms of where we see the most meaningful engagement is where citizens have been informed about the budget the budget totals, the overall fiscal situation as part of the engagement process. And this enables them to have better capacity in order to participate meaningfully. And the other thing is that citizens, where they are participating, they expect to see some sort of result or some sort of evidence that the views that they've given forward are actually usefully used in the oversight process. And so I think there is a lot of potential to scale up with social media. But I do think we need to think about how, in that context, we can still ensure that we can improve fiscal literacy as part of that process and still give feedback to citizens about how it's used. I think Brazil would be an example of a country which is particularly innovative in its use of online platforms to engage with citizens as part of the budget process, although that's on the government side rather than the legislative side, as far as I know.
We use the platform, some panels for showing the budget information and getting information for the society throughout the budget process also in Senate. So not only the executive, but the Congress is using this type of tool.
United States.
So question on a different topic. You mentioned the need for a greater spotlight on long-term sustainability. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about that, and also add if you have any thoughts on how to get people to pay attention to that issue when we do produce information about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that one of the things that we've seen is that these reports do tend to be tabled, but they're not brought to plenary, and there's no formal debate around, what are the main budgetary challenges we face, which I think is really critical for improving overall fiscal literacy amongst our elected officials around those medium and longer term challenges that are faced and that can really help frame the annual budget process. And again, in my own country, Scotland, just this year, for example, the Budget Committee asked the government if it could formally have a debate on long-term fiscal sustainability, or I think the Budget Committee asked Parliament, if it could formally have the time for a debate. And what we've seen is that there's just a much broader understanding as a result of that debate that took place in plenary of those broader fiscal challenges. And so I think budget committees pushing to have these debates in plenary is one of the key ways that we can see those fiscal issues become more prominently in the minds of a broader range of elected officials, which is helpful then for the annual budget process.
Shuri, I have a question about legislative power. And we answered questions in the survey about the ability to scrutinize and ability to review, ability to approve the budget. And in those cases, I think it was mostly talking about you can't spend money unless the legislature approves it. What about the flip side of that? We're having a sort of well-publicized debate in our polity about once the Congress approves spending, does that funding have to be spent, and also if the legislature has approved the collection of funds, do those funds actually have to be collected?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question, actually. And typically we've seen that what gets the most attention in the budget process is the approval. And actually this sort of implementation and ex post analysis of whether it was implemented as intended doesn't always get the same light of day. And in particular, one of the reasons for that is even the information is not always presented in a way that is even comparable with the kind of way in which the budget was approved, right? So this sort of line of sight between the different stages of the budget can be obstructed. So I do think that there's scope to put a greater spotlight also on that phase of the budget and to really try and improve line of sight and improve transparency on that phase so that there can be greater scrutiny of whether the budget was implemented as intended. And I think I think that post-COVID in particular, a lot of governments, I guess, learnt new ways in which they could amend the budget outside the formal process, which has meant that the budget that was spent at the end is not necessarily comparable with what was approved. And I don't necessarily think oversight procedures have caught up with these new ways in which the government adjusts the budget throughout the year. And yeah.
Thank you. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we're going to break 5 minutes early for the coffee break. We're not going to yield back any time, so please return. The coffee break is a half hour, so we will start promptly at 11:25. Thank you. The coffee break is in the hall that way. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Session 5 will start now. We're going to be highlighting the... Hang on a second. Two minutes.
We're going to be supporting it.
Well, yeah, we'll see after if it's a good job or not.
Okay, session number 5, defense spending. We're going to discuss the rising profile of defense spending in many of our countries and the challenges and strategies for effective oversight. To get us started, Yves Giroux, the Parliamentary Budget Officer Canada, is going to give a presentation. Yves, And I hope you've stretched in case you need to provide the national dance of Canada.
No chance in hell of that. I will pretend that we don't have a national dance until you torture me for me to say the opposite. So I didn't have time to set up my alarm clock so you'll give me a...
Please a little closer to the mic.
Oh, okay. I've rarely been told to get shorter, so... Maybe like that? Okay. So, we have done some work on defense over the last several years, and I'm here to tell you what we did, generally speaking. As most of you should know what a PBO does, we'll probably go rather quickly on our mandate, but if you have no idea what a parliamentary budget officer does, I think you're in the wrong room, just saying. I'll talk about the type of defense work that we have undertaken over the years. I'll also try to talk about the impact of independent fiscal institution defense oversight has had in Canada, the challenges, and the main takeaways after almost 7 years of having done that type of work. So the mandate of the Canadian PBO, like many of yours, but maybe slightly different in some respect, is to provide obviously independent and non-partisan fiscal analysis to the House of Commons, so elected MPs, but also unelected and appointed senators. We also respond to individual requests from committees or individual parliamentarians, and we get the varying qualities of requests. I can expand on that under very strict Chatham House rules, but I don't think they're strict enough for me to go in details on that aspect. We also have to report on the state of the nation's finances and the economy. And importantly, we have the authority to self-initiate reports on matters of fiscal importance. And that's where most of the work on defense falls, because it tends to be of huge fiscal importance in the context of Canadian fiscal issues. So, Canadian defense context. We are a middle-sized country. We often think of ourselves as a small country. We don't spend a lot on defense. Last count, we were at 1.37% of GDP, which is not a lot. It's in fact lower than most countries in this room, and that's significantly below the NATO target of 2%. And it has been the case for several years, if not decades. So we have significantly underinvested in defense compared to most other countries. In 2010, my predecessors was in the middle of a controversy regarding the cost of the purchase of F-35 jets. So that was the first major controversy of the Canadian PBO, where my predecessor again indicated that the cost of buying these jets would be much higher than the government was claiming. We have also been experiencing cost overruns, and I think that's probably an understatement. I'll give you examples later on. So everything that we seem to want to buy when it comes to military equipment seems to either not exist or be significantly more expensive than initially planned, sometimes by a factor of 2, 3, or even 4, and counting. And there's typically very limited oversight capacity in Parliament because it tends to, as you all suspect, it's very specialized. There's very few dealerships of warships and tanks, so the alternative data is very difficult to find. Parliamentarians have to take military experts at their words, and they're very poorly equipped to challenge the statements of ministers and senior public servants. So the types of defense analysis that we do, there's a wide scope. You would think that defense, it's estimating the cost of buying military equipment, and that's also what I thought would be the main elements of working on defense. But when you start looking at defense, you can, of course, look at the cost of buying equipment, so major procurements. But even in that sphere, there's the cost of procuring the military equipment, but there's also a scope to look at the risk and sensitivity analysis, and by that I mean what would the costs be if, for example, there were to be 1 or 2 year delays, higher inflation, fluctuations in the exchange rate. So there's that. And there's also scope to do the analysis not just of purchasing the equipment, but also its life cycle costs. So for example, it's one thing to buy warships, but how much does it cost to buy a specific type of warships to operate them over the 40-year lifespan? So you may think you're doing a good deal by buying a cheaper ship, but if it costs more to operate over a 40-year lifespan, that's something that has to be factored into the equation. We also do projections of military expenditures in the context of the 2%. We also look at planned capital spending, and there's always plans, and then events get in the way of the best plans. We also did a force structure model, and we have also other type of analysis when it comes to personnel generation models. So, analysis of major procurement projects. We are currently in the process of acquiring a variety of defense platforms to replace those currently in service, notably our old and decrepit F-18s. And to sustain the life of our old fleet of F-18s, we bought second-hand F-18s from Australia. And to my surprise, when I naively asked, will they be flown over to Canada? People said, oh, no way, it's too far. We would miss, we would lose a few on the way and they'd have to refuel. So that's the state of our military at the currently, especially the Air Force. So we need to buy new equipment. So they'll be replaced by the F-35s. We're also in the midst of a shipbuilding strategy where we will replace our old destroyers by new, hopefully top of the line military warships. And that means there's a lot of parliamentary requests, parliamentary interest when it comes to military spending, if only on the purchasing equipment. So for these types of analysis, we build our own in-house models based on publicly available data and also proprietary departmental data, so data that's held in the Department of National Defense. On a case-by-case basis, we also conduct sensitivity analysis, as I mentioned, the cost implications of a 1 year, 2 year delays, higher or lower inflation, we can always dream, and also fluctuation in the exchange rates, which has a big impact when you're procuring military equipment that is very often built abroad or has a heavy foreign component. So one example of military procurement that we did or costing recently, and you can probably see nice colors, but not all of the information on this slide, it's the F-35 program. So in that case, it was relatively simple because the F-35 is a known fighter jet which is being produced, has been acquired by air forces around the world. So the main issue for us was not getting data, but it was putting it in a Canadian context, because you can't just buy F-35s off the shelf. You have to adapt them to the specific needs of each Air Force. So we were able to do that costing. The acquisition cost is one thing, but what is very important in the context of long-term procurement projects is also the operation and sustainment phases. And we were able to estimate that based on the help of other air forces and notably the CBO in the US, which has pretty good data compared to most other countries. So that was a possibility, and we estimated that the cost would be $74 billion over the life cycle of the fighter jets, as opposed to the price tag of just acquiring the fighter jets of $20 billion. So you go from $20 billion for the acquisition cost to 74 billion Canadian dollars for the whole life cycle cost. So that gives a more fulsome picture to parliamentarians when they decide or they debate acquiring one piece of equipment rather than the other. So for reference, 74 billion Canadian dollars is about 52.5 US and 47 billion euros. And in Chilean pesos, I didn't do the calculation, but there are more zeros than I can count right now. So I don't want to confuse you with zeros. Another piece of equipment that I talked about is the acquisition of 15 warships. They're the Type 26, sorry, for those of you who are cognizant of military warships. Senator Pugh is probably one of them. There were a couple of options. We also, as part of our costing, we looked at the cost of buying these 15 warships and operating them over their 40-year lifespan. In a previous report, we also explored the potential costs of other types of warships that would fulfill similar missions, and we arrived at slightly different cost estimates. But given that the Canadian military had decided on the Type 26, which is a British design, we further refined our analysis to include the life cycle costs. So you'll see that the cost is about 84.5 billion Canadian dollars to acquire 15 ships. Just that number can make your head spin. If you think 15 warships, $84 billion, it's pretty expensive per warship. The reason is mostly because there was a political decision to have them built in Canada for national security reason, also for economic benefits, economic spin-off reasons, and of course for regional equity reasons. They were split in more than one shipyard. So all these factors contribute to increasing the cost. So that was our estimate, $84 billion to acquire, over $300 billion if you include fuel, personnel, spare parts over the 40-year lifespan, and disposal, which costs a few hundred millions, because apparently you can't just sink old ships in the middle of the ocean. You have to remove toxic chemicals and weapons, so it costs a lot. So that's our cost estimate. Let's focus on the $84 billion, which is in a stark contrast with the national defense estimate, which initially indicated, don't worry, it's going to cost $22 billion. So that's the number they put out there without explanation. With our analysis and the information gathering we made, talking to other PBOs around the world and looking at the data, historical data, and so on, we arrived at an estimate that was initially in the $70 billion range, which ramped up to $85 billion range. And over time, the Department of National Defense gradually, but very gradually and reluctantly admitted that the cost would be higher than $22 billion. So right there, I believe that without a PBO, the number in the public domain would have been $22 billion for 15 ships, whereas the real cost is very likely to be around or above $84 billion. I'm not saying that it is wasteful spending, that it is unnecessary. There are very good reasons to buy that type of ship, operational requirements. I'm not a military expert, neither is my staff. So national security concerns, regional development rationale, these are all valid points, but I believe that it's our duty to make these numbers part of the public debate so that parliamentarians can make these decisions with better information. Another area that is of high interest in Canada, and I suspect in many other countries, is reaching the 2% NATO target and probably exceeding that 2% if it gets increased to 3 or more. So we had a history of not meeting the 2% that successive governments had agreed would be nice to meet eventually in the future after the next several elections. But recently, there has been a commitment to reach that faster. For example, during the last electoral campaign that took place in March and April, different parties reaffirmed commitments made by the previous government to reach 2%, but by 2032. That sounds like a long time and sufficient time to ramp up spending. But when you talk to people, you instinctively we're at 1.37, 1.4, reaching 2%, not that big of a stretch. So the government's made these commitments, like the previous and the current, but they didn't indicate how much it would cost. They said, yes, Canada will be a good student and will be meeting our commitment. We'll reach 2% by 2032. And then the new Prime Minister said, well, we'll do faster. We'll do 2030. So in the abstract, 2% of GDP is a low number, 1.4, 2%. But when you determine that it will be, when you start putting numbers, real numbers, meat around that bone, that's where it hits. Because currently at 1.4%, we're spending about 41 billion Canadian dollars. And when you say, you indicate to Canadians, from 1.4% to 2% in 2032, that means doubling the current spending on defense. That's where it starts to resonate. And you don't need to be a military expert to do that kind of calculation. It's simple rule of thumb. You just need to have a sound basis for your GDP projection. So that's the kind of, I think, the kind of contribution that the PBO can fairly easily make to the public debate by just putting a different perspective on the same numbers. So the government had committed that we'll meet 2% by 2032, just saying 2%, not saying it would mean doubling the current expenditures from 41 to $82 billion. But when a PBO, independent, nonpartisan entity says, you know, guys, it would mean doubling spending, and that would mean that the federal government would spend more on defense than it provides funding to provinces for healthcare. That's where it starts to trigger good discussions about the potential trade-offs of making that type of spending decision versus something else. And again, you don't need to be a nerd of military doctrine and spending. So that's something that's very helpful. One added problem with the government's projection is that DND, the Department of National Defense, had released its own forecast as to what it would mean in terms of defense spending for GDP, but inadvertently they factored in a 4-year recession. They said, I think they confused nominal and real GDP growth, so they had 4 years of GDP growing at below inflation. So before they released that, or shortly after, we pointed out, like, hey, you may have made a mistake. You had 4 years of growth that's below the government's inflation projection. And they stubbornly stuck to their forecast. So they were in a hole and they kept digging, even though we told them. So again, it's something to point out that you don't need to be an expert in military personnel doctrine or war fighting. You just need to be comfortable with numbers. That's what it very often boils down to. So we spotted a blatant mistake that the government made in its forecasting, but to that date, they haven't changed it. It's my story and I'm sticking to it. It seems to be their motto. So it leads me to another aspect that it's fairly easy for us as economists to focus on. Military departments, forces, defense departments usually publish capital spending forecasts. They have plans, great plans, and they always promise to, well, in our case at least, they promise to spend on capital equipment. So they have these plans, they get approved by parliamentarians. Very rarely do people make any follow-up. Parliamentarians come and go, they forget, other priorities get in the way. So I think that's where we made also a contribution. The Department of National Defense had its long-term 20-year capital plan. So we asked them initially for their plan, then they upgraded their plans, and as very often happens, the best laid plans, the greatest intentions, then it takes time to get off the ground. They experience delays, COVID, personal shortages, all the reasons that you usually expect, and it was slow to get going. But when you have a fixed envelope and you start spending very slowly, you reprofile out into the future a fixed envelope. That means that its real value diminishes. So by doing that analysis and publishing a report, we brought before parliamentarians the concept that if you have a $200 billion capital envelope over 20 years, if you're very slow to get going, and you promise to spend a lot at the end, the real value has eroded. It's not the same $200 billion. Inflation will have eroded a good chunk of that envelope. And again, you don't need to be a military expert to bring that type of analysis in front of parliamentarians. They will understand that very well. And again, you don't need to dig very deep. These plans are very often publicly available. They're either in the public accounts, in the estimates, in the supply bills. So they exist. It's very often just a matter of harvesting the information, putting it in a comprehensive or understandable format for parliamentarians to use that and hold the government to account. Another area that I initially thought was not going to be very useful and that analysts convinced me we should be doing is to do a force structure model. So I didn't know at first what it meant when they first presented me with the idea, but it's using information that is available, maybe not publicly, some of it publicly available, but other type of information that's within the Department of National Defense. And that force structure model allows us to play with the different scenarios. For example, if we were to remove a battalion of tanks and instead create a submarine unit, how much would that cost or how much would we save? This information is usually not classified, not always. Sometimes it is when you're talking about commandos and so on. And yes, Canada has commandos, but if I give you details, I'll have to shoot you. So we do have that. So we don't get into classified information, but very often, like the number of infantry battalions or warship support units, that exists. And that allows us to develop that type of model, which I think exists in other countries, but it didn't exist in Canada. So by putting that model out there, it allowed parliamentarians to be better informed and also ask questions of senior military personnel as to why don't we have this? Why should we have that many units of specialized, artillery and so on? So it's a piece of information that already existed, but by putting it in one place in accessible format, we allowed parliamentarians to ask questions, but also get better informed that it's not sufficient to just buy a couple of warships. You need to have support units with that. For example, if you increase the size of the armed forces, you need to have field hospitals, you need to have medical personnel, you also need to have the support structure behind. And the model allows us to do that. So very often parliamentarians not having full information will say, well, if you increase the Canadian forces by 5,000, they do a simple rule of thumb, 5,000 personnel multiplied by the annual salary, it should cost that much. But if you have a force structure model, they can understand that there is a logistics that goes behind increasing the force in certain types of areas. It's by no means intended to be a precise estimate on which to base budget recommendations, but it's basic information for parliamentarians. It's not something that we pretend should be the basis for military decisions. It's not intended to do that, or it doesn't reflect very recent changes in military technology or doctrine. So it's not the intent. The intent is not for that to be used as the basis for strategic decisions, but it's intended to give a very good idea of the costs, which are more than just military pay. For example, it includes benefits, and pensions in the case of military personnel is a significant component of the overall compensation. So the impact of the IFI oversight over defense spending, there's a couple of impacts that I've noticed over time, and I brought, this is just a short sample of the reports we've done over time. So, and these are just the English versions. We have to do in English and French. So, and it's not all that we've done. So we've done quite a bit. We found that, and based on feedback from parliamentarians, it equips parliamentarians with better and relevant information that equips them in their debates. Otherwise, in the absence of a PBO or IFI doing that type of work, they have to rely solely on the Department of National Defense and military contractors. So you can imagine how biased the information can be seen to be if in a decision to buy warships, the only people testifying at House or Senate committees are top military personnel and shipyard owners. So it's very difficult for any parliamentarian to ask relevant questions or to push back on some statements. So it allows them to hold the government to account, and they can more easily challenge stakeholder statements. It also helps to increase the public's awareness of defense costs, because the public can think that a warship or a tank costs just the cost that the steel component, but by publishing these reports, yes, it can be astonishing to realize that a warship costs $5 billion, but it also starts a discussion in the general public and among stakeholders. And when we publish these reports, we often see in the days and weeks after that there are military experts testifying or explaining in the general media, mainstream media, that yes, it's expensive to buy a warship because it's not like the cruise ship. You need military equipment, you need backup systems. So it starts a discussion. And we find that there's a widespread lack of understanding about parliamentarians and the public about what it costs to properly equip defense forces. It also forces us to appear very frequently at House and Senate committees because our reports are seen as independent and nonpartisan. So we're asked not to talk about this type of equipment versus that type, but for example, how did you arrive at that costing? What is the source of the delays? Sometimes we can answer, sometimes we can, but it generates even more interest in issues of national security. And it also, and that's the most important point, it encourages ministers, senior officials to be much more transparent and honest about their own costings. For example, if we didn't have these costings on the F-35s, not so much that, but on the warships, I don't think the Department of National Defense would have moved from their $22 billion estimate, unrealistic estimate. So it forces them to be honest about a bill that will have to be paid anyways. Once you've made a decision to procure a certain type of ship and you've signed contract, what's the point about not being transparent? The bill will have to be paid. Challenges. There are a few, as you can imagine. So one of the main challenges is resistance from the Defense Ministry to be open and transparent. Very often they're worried about national security issues or competitiveness issues when they're about to go tender for contracts. But more often than not, it's about laziness and not being willing to show their hands and how they arrived at cost estimates. A good case in point is when we discovered that they had used a wrong estimate for GDP. They went for something else than the Department of Defense had just released in the budget or the fiscal update. So there's no reason for that except inadvertent mistake. So it forces them to be much more honest. They often disagree with our estimates. That happens, and you can talk to Ireland about that. There is some disagreement about an estimate they did. I promised Annette I wouldn't say that, but I couldn't resist. Sorry, Annette. Chatham House rules, right? We also receive pushback from time to time from commercial partners when we release estimate and saying that a certain type of military equipment will cost way more than what the Department of National Defense and its private sector partner indicates. We've been threatened with lawsuits. It happens, but it's one of the risks and challenges. You have to have somewhat of a thick skin when you enter into that foray and you start costing defense issues, because you're going against potentially vested interests that have literally billions of dollars at stake and the equipment that will allow their job to be easy or less easy depending on which type of equipment the government decides to buy. So because we're transparent about our assumptions, data sources, and and the methodology, our reports are often perceived, very often in fact, perceived to be more trustworthy than those of the government, which does not in general produce publicly available cost analysis. They tend to release just the headline number and be silent about how they arrived at that estimate. So because of that, we tend to be seen as more reliable and trustworthy. Probably unfair to departments because they have different constraints than we do, but it allows us to shed a useful light on a very expensive aspect of our respective government spending. It's also quite difficult sometimes to obtain the data that we need to construct a model for the purposes of estimating costs. And even when the data can be found, it's hard to know whether it's an apples to apples comparison or whether we're trying to compare things that are not comparable. For example, there's a Canadian context that cannot always be easily replicated. If we're buying, for example, icebreakers, yeah, we can compare with Russia, Finland, and the US. But if we're buying warships that have to have specific requirements to navigate Arctic waters, it's not necessarily the case that the Italian data that we got will be applicable to Canada. So, and add to the fact that defense data is often quite sensitive from a commercial but a national security reason. So it can be especially hard to obtain data. And we operate, obviously, with small analytical teams, whereas defense ministries tend to have larger specialized staff dedicated to costing defense procurement programs and all the military equipment and personnel. So, and we're also staffed mostly by economists. Not that I don't like economists, I'm one, but there's generally not a large overlap between economists and people specialized in defense, and that, I think, is an understatement. So it's not natural for us economists to fully understand defense requirements and defense costing. So it's a challenge. It doesn't mean it can't be overcome. But having a small team means employees are rotated onto different files regularly, so it can be difficult to build and maintain the expertise. For example, in my group, there's 2 analysts dedicated to defense. So if one of them calls me and says, bye-bye, adios, I'm working somewhere else from next week on, I'll have lost significant expertise. So it's a risk, but there's a variety of ways to mitigate these risks. For example, when it comes to data and comparability, we've developed or we've used a methodology developed elsewhere, I don't remember, a way to estimate the cost of procuring equipment. For example, you can have same mission, different size. I'm talking about warships. Same mission, smaller or bigger ships. You do an analysis based on that. You have then same weight or same size, different mission, and you do a combination of both. And when you're talking about dozens of billions, you usually get quickly in the ballpark. You also use experience of older platforms, warships we have, and will continue to have, so there is historical data on that, and obviously international experience. Am I done?
Are you done?
I'm at takeaways.
Okay, so that was terrific, Yves. I would now ask Senator Kenneth Pugh to offer reflections and get the conversation started. Senator.
Good job. Thank you. Dear delegates, thanks for this opportunity, and thanks for a now expert in defense budgeting. This is one of the most difficult issues every parliament has to face because of the nature. Defense is national security, and in some cases, this is strictly secret, and there is no information. So first, I do agree that we have not an asymmetry between people, it's also information asymmetry. But in order to solve this, every country has to arrive to an agreement. and it's a political agreement. How much will be that defense budget, the expenditure? And we can have two eyes. On one side is the insurance. Okay, we have something that will really keep us to being a nation. That is very important. But the other one, it's also to improve investment, because defense and development goes together. And this is my first reflection. It's not expenditure, it's an inversion if you do it with your partners in your country. And when I say with your partners, for instance, it's very interesting, Canada saying us that they're going to procure 15 frigates, Type 26 designs by the British. So now we have these joint ventures. And then governments have to talk government to government. On defense, this is very special. It's not an open market. There's actually no market. You have to define where you're going to be. Chile, as a country that has signed the largest amount of free trade agreements, we were the first one to do it with China. Well, we have geopolitical problems also. Are we going to procure equipment from other countries rather than the ones that we should be spending? So our first conclusion in the Defense Committee was we're not only an OECD country, we are a NATO ally. So NATO and NATO standards are the ones that will help to solve the problem. Because investment in countries, they can go everywhere. For instance, the light, the power electricity here is owned by State Grid. This is the largest Chinese company in the world. And why we have this here, not because we don't have a screening of investment, it's because we are in an open market. And initially, these critical infrastructure was bought by an American company, Sempra from California. They were the owners. And what did Sempra did? They sold their actives to China. So now we have a problem here. So this is something to get back to the US, to my colleagues in the Senate. Also, you have to prevent your company to sell their actives to others. Because when you have to defend something, you have to find first what are the threats. Take the case of Ukraine. 3 months before Russia invaded Ukraine, we hold a meeting. I'm a member of the International Group of Parliamentarians on Security and Intelligence in Washington, December. We were speaking with our Ukrainian colleagues from the Rada, that's the name of their parliament. And they explain us how will be the attack of Russia on Ukraine. My counterpart, former MP of Ukraine, Mariana Betsula, told us it's going to be this way, they're going to attack on this day, they're going to do this operation. He missed everything only for 1 day. So intelligence is the first asset that you have to fund. But we don't speak about intelligence because that's something that is not good to even know how much money you're spending on it. If you don't have good intelligence, well, you will suffer, and you will suffer a lot. Second thing is the evolving of all technology now being used by everybody. Also in Ukraine, we can see now that little drones, which cost nothing, they can destroy large ships using a remote control vessel or even aircraft. There was a shooting of an aircraft by one of these surface vessels with remote control. So now we're facing a new problem, which is how technology will be affecting. Are we prepared to receive an attack of a swarm of drones? Well, we have to discuss this because it's not the old times. Chile, when it joined the OECD in 2010, we were not doing properly our task in defense budget and defense expenditure. We were the 31st country to join OECD. And we decided to align as much as possible. One of the problems we had was our way to produce a budget. And you can take the year 2019, it took us 9 years being in the OECD, to change our mechanism to fund the strategic capabilities of the country. But we need first a political agreement. How are we going to do it? Previous 2019, 10% of the income of the sales of copper from the government were going to not a budget for defense, but a fund, a strategic fund, from where the government took a little part, in order to fund the strategic capabilities. But everybody thought, oh, Chile is spending 10% of all the income of sales of copper. We index it because copper is very important. Now, funny thing is nowadays, salmons, sometimes they produce more income than copper. So it's funny, maybe salmons will be funding better the defense. Now it's the traceability, where the funds are obtained and how we're going to do. If you check the World Bank, you are going to see that we are very similar to Canada. And that's why I really thank you, because it's very easy to explain based on the Canadian example that you have already received. In our case, we have the same, a Senate, but we are fully elected, not appointed like our Canadian colleagues, and members of the parliament who are also elected. There is not enough knowledge in the parliamentarians about defense. And this is the first asymmetry in politics. There's no knowledge. There are no teams prepared. So basically, you're very right, the ministries and all the organizations, they have not only the knowledge, they know the rules and they know everything. So you have to make this agreement based on something that you can know. First decision, are you going to invest in the country, or you're going to be buying carefully used aircraft, as we do? From the Netherlands, from the US, we have received the F-16, but we have made plans to upgrade the mid-life cycle. Type 23 frigates from the British, we also bought it carefully used. But with Canada, Lockheed Martin Canada, we did the mid-life upgrade. At the same standard at New Zealand and Australia, New Zealand and Australian navies. So Chile is doing the best it can do with the budget. World Bank says that we spent 1.6% of our GNP. So we are even lower than Canada, and we are not most probably achieve the 2% of NATO country. We would like to be a NATO country because we have NATO challenges. And then we go to the challenges. Why we have a defense? For what? In Chile, specifically, in order to preserve, of course, the country for every attack, not only the neighbors. Now we're being attacked by the cyberspace, by everybody. North Korea, China, Russia, you name it. But also in two choke points. As a maritime country, Chile uses the maritime sea lanes in order to export, and we're very good at exporting. Panama Canal, as I told you before, it produced a collapse of Valparaiso because everybody went through the Panama Canal. So you could say, oh, it was bad for Chile. No, it was very good. Panama Canal shortened us our routes to the US, East Coast, and Europe. Chile is the third largest user of the Panama Canal. First is China, who's controlling the canal, then the US, and the third one is Chile. So we created, this is something that we work with the joint forces that are in the Caribbean, the South Command, an exercise called Panamax, the defense of the Panama Canal. Now, to defend the Panama Canal on the Pacific side, you need everything. You need aircraft, submarines, ships, people. So we have strategic challenges. Also, the other choke point is the South Pacific, the cross through the Drake Passage, Cape Horn, still being used, but all the ships that are not using Panama Canal because they have normally toxics or bacteriological or atomic things. So it's another place where we need. Search and rescue. We have, as I told, commitments all around vast areas where you need long-range aircraft. Chile carefully operates US P-3s, 60 years old, still serving, and has commitments in the Antarctica, where we need more operations during winter time in order to get more knowledge of how climate change is affecting the area. And that's why I said it's very important, the international collaboration. Chile has a shipyard, actually 3 shipyards that build ships. But with a Canadian shipyard, Vard, they designed an icebreaker. But we built the icebreaker, so please add Chile to the list of the icebreaker suppliers. It's already working in the south on its first winter campaign and providing capability to operate in 1 meter winter ice breaking capability. So we need to define what are the challenges, where the country, the interests of the countries are, in order to create a force. There are 2 ways to make this force structure. One is based on threats. And the other one, which we have chosen, is based on capabilities. So it doesn't matter what the threats are. We prepare for everything. And that's the reason why we created in 2019, and I will give you the number, you can check it later on, Law number 21174. Law 21174 stop the fund from the 10% of sales of copper and started a new process for funding the strategic capabilities. And strategic capabilities are at sea, in land, in the air, in the space, and cyberspace. We don't have to forget this part. We haven't yet done the decision how to do it like Brazil, for instance. In Brazil, the decision was Army will take the development of all the resources of cyberspace. Air Force will take the responsibility of creating and producing all satellites. Navy, they will take the control of new submarines to protect the submarine platform. So then you have a strategy. You have every service with a mission, with a purpose, in order to produce the best for the country, with the country. Brazil is building everything on site. So defense should need a purpose, should need a mission, but specifically a strategy. Chile's capability planning is a way to do it, and that is why it's in our law. The budget, it's not done yearly. For strategic capabilities, Chile has a 12-year planning, 12-year. This is 3 consecutive governments. In 12 years, you can fund with flows, cash flows, well, any procurement. So you have already defined. And to have a sort of a buffer, there are already 4 years allocated from those 12 years of flows. And we discuss in this parliament only the 5th year. So we're adding 1 year, which is not part of the current government discussions. It will be for the next government. So it's easier to agree and to get political agreements once you are not involved in the decision. Maybe if you win the elections, but that's something you will know. This way is the way we find it, the proper way in order to have a midterm vision, 12-year, 3 governments, as the maximum time a deputy can be in the House of Deputies, because they have only 2 re-elections, and they are for 4 years, 4 times 3, 12. So actually it's a political planning process, because people will be involved for 12 years, and they can support it. For funding, now we are getting money from different areas, not only the copper, with the copper fund initially, but also we have to add the major procurement that the country wants to do it with the national industry. And that means that we have to define if we're going to build frigates, for instance, or we are still going to use carefully cleared frigates. It's something that should be decided. But we're very open. As I said, the Type 23 frigates were made all the retrofit with a Canadian company. Nowadays, the last 2 frigates, the award was won by Turkey. So we have Turkey now providing system and services to the country. Chile is very open. It's very open to all of you that are here. So it's good to know each other, good to know where there are common interests, and have the governments talk. The government-to-government discussions is very important for life cycle cost. If we go back, and you remember, 306 billion for 15 frigates. You say, you're crazy. Well, they're very expensive. 5 billion per piece, only for procurement. That's the 80 billion. 1.4% just for doing and designing the project. It takes a lot of time. You have to make the RFI, request for information, RFP, the proposal. Then you have to decide what you're going to use. Well, we use data. We created in Chile a program that has the name of a lady that presents all the data of the RFP, and ideally you have to have more than 3,000 items in order to check, which is monitored by another team, not the one that wrote all the RFP, is another one will check that the RFP is really fulfilled. And then they will have all this information in a heat map. So the Ministry of Defense could say, okay, you have to choose. These are the results. And if you want to click, double click, do third click, do it. Because it will be a political decision at the end, but based on data. And when it's agreed, everything, it's converted to a contract immediately. This is a transactional process where you go RFI, RFP, the validation, the decision, and the contract, not to have any difference. So if we can give an experience for the people who would like to know more about defense budgeting, this is the best way. Ships will last for 35 years. We are in the 40 years range, and you need to cost it completely. Cost of operation, and for that you need parameters, like for instance, days at sea. This means the ship is being used and it's really navigating. So you need fuel, you need oil, you need satellite communication, you need everything. So the cost elements are very high. And that will make it, okay, if you receive more fuel and you don't have money for data, well, it's not good to sail, so make all the movement of money in order to balance. Balance budgeting within the armed forces is difficult. As you said, we're going to remove a division or we are going to change. Well, you have to balance. You cannot go beyond the GNP that's involved. Second, I'm going through the ideas. Yes?
I do want to be a little bit mindful of time to make sure that we have a chance for interactions. Yes.
Don't worry. I'm almost closing because I'm in my last page here. I was really very motivated. What we would like to say as a country, we are a little country, very similar to Canada, but Chile goes from one coast to the other coast. We have half of the Canadian Navy in the Pacific, so it's very similar. We have the same F-16 aircraft, and we have the same problems. What I would like to say is numbers speaks by themselves, numbers. I was, as a naval officer, in charge of procurement within the Navy and designing equipment. I also work in Israel, designing with them capabilities, strategic capability. But my most challenging position in the Navy was not to be in Canada, was to be the first director of a hospital, not being a medical doctor. And I was there because the numbers was in red. You don't need to be an expert in health. You need to know numbers. So you don't need to be defense experts. You need to know numbers. And that will help that really they have doing the good job. They will not be a failure. And the results you're getting is safety, security, but also investment. They have both sides of the coin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two questions before we take the rest of our questions to lunch. So if someone has a question, a burning issue they want to ask either our presenter or our discussant, please raise your table tent now. OECD, Eddie.
So a really stupid question, because I come from Ireland and I don't know anything about military expenditure, but for Eves, like, do they not sell on these aircraft in most cases? So my impression is that the US sells on fighter jets, say, very often before they would get to the end of the life cycle, so that they would recoup some of the costs and they wouldn't have the disposal costs and things like that.
Well, merci. So, yes, very often it's sold as a concept. It hasn't, but by the time we get into the costings, it's more advanced than just the choice and the contract. We're starting to, or we're very close to, or starting to take delivery. But usually at this point, the Departments of Defense, they usually don't have a firm handle on the costing, even at that point. So they sign contracts. There are very often some open-ended clauses, so they commit to spending at least that much and buy that many, but there's often clauses for more and additional add-ons. So it depends. It's not a contract like you buy a car, which is often what people think. It's much more open-ended than that, and that's why I think there's an important role for IFIs to step into that area and provide useful information, because it's contracts that evolve and that gets amended. There's add-ons. That's what we find, especially with the warships, that they buy a certain design with a certain lightweight ship, and then military personnel get in and they say, would be nice to have this, or that doesn't make any sense, we need to replace it with this. So the costs increase because the requirements change and evolve. The ships get heavier, they need larger engines, and it's a spiral that ends when you get the delivery of the last ship, by which time it's pretty late to get full information.
Thank you. United Kingdom?
Thank you. In the Canadian context, you mentioned that defence oversight in Parliament's relatively limited. I wonder if you could just expand on that and talk a bit about some of the structures involved, and whether you think that's a function of kind of a historical lack of information, or if there are sort of constitutional constraints on that as well, and the way that you're now producing information in that, is that likely to lead to change in that area?
So the lack of oversight capacity, I think, is mostly related to the fact that there's an imbalance, asymmetry of information, because departments have to report or have to answer questions of House committees and defense committees, on both the House and the Senate. And they have the power to require senior officials and ministers to testify virtually at any point in time. But when they're told, parliamentarians, they're told by senior military personnel or contractors, this is the type of ship we need, and it's going to cost this much. A senator or an MP, member of parliament, who doesn't have support staff to challenge these numbers, is very ill-equipped to say that. Very often, their line of questioning will be based on anecdotes, because some of their constituents work at the shipyard or they have sources in the military, but anecdotes do not equip well parliamentarians to challenge top military brass or contractors. And very often, shipyards are very powerful. They're powerful interests. So it's not a constitutional issue. I think it's an asymmetry of information by and large. And to be honest, there's also an acute lack of interest by many in defense spending. They see that as a bill to pay, and there's nothing much that we can do. Unfortunately, there's a few parliamentarians that have a keen interest, sometimes depending on their background, and same with the media. There are some journalists and media persons that are interested, but by and large, for them, a warship could be 35,000 tons or 1 million tons. They have no idea. They can't make the difference. So there's a deep, deep lack of knowledge and often of interest. It's going to cost billions, dozen billions, 100 billions. It's big numbers. Who cares? So there's that general attitude, sadly.
Just to add to that, in the UK, my experience of this is that parliamentarians care a lot when things go over budget, and the ex post scrutiny of these things, that gets a lot of attention. So if there's been a terrible procurement that's really expensive, they will kick off about that. But on the projected spending side, that's a similar experience to you there, where they see it as something to be dealt with further down the line.
And I would add that's probably where we have an important role to play as IFIs, where you have military personnel, government spokesperson, ministers saying it's going to cost dozens of billions for this, and that. And they have an interest in not being fully transparent, because people would say, holy smokes, it's very expensive. So having people with infographics, explanations that are plain language, easy to understand, rather than smoke and mirror, that's where it can elevate the debate. It sounds ironic, you dumb it down and you elevate the debate, but you allow people to fully understand that it's going to cost that many billions per ship and that many billions over 40 years to operate the ships, and it's expensive, but like you can start a conversation by putting accurate numbers on the different pieces of the puzzle.
Thank you. Before we break for lunch, I wanted to offer two thoughts. One is I wholeheartedly agree with Eve that this is something that parliamentary budget offices and independent fiscal institutions can do. We all are equipped with the ability to look at the data that are available to us and look at historical cost overruns and be able to provide information on that dimension. One thing I want to pick up on is something the senator mentioned earlier, though, was there is a flip side that parliamentarians care about just as much. And so on one hand, we have cost overruns, which is, of course, a deep concern. Another one is under delivery of performance. And one of the lines of business that we've been getting into recently is looking at how much time do planes have to be refurbished, how often, and for how long are ships in dry dock. And being able to address how much readiness do you actually get for dollars spent or for currency spent can be incredibly important for these discussions. So now we're going to move on to lunch. So we're going to be moving up to the restaurant on the 15th floor, and please follow our guides that way. And we'll get more directions after we go that way. Thank you very much. Is that we have to figure ways to manage with scarcity. In this case, we're running a bit behind, and so we need to manage the scarcity of time. So I'm going, at this point I ask Mr. Jan Toth, the chair of Budget Responsibility for the Slovak Republic, to make his presentation, which had asked him to cut down on the fly to be a bit shorter than he had anticipated. So if you could limit your remarks, but only hit the most interesting things you were going to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, how much time do I have? It's 15 minutes, 20 or?
10.
10, okay. So thank you for inviting me to give the very last presentation after such a heavy lunch. It means that I would need to talk about a celebrity to keep us awake. So let's talk about Trump effects. As we know, the decisions of the new US administration could have a dramatic impact on certain economies, especially the economies that are extremely small, open, manufacturing-oriented, producing cars. And Maybe one prime example of such a very small open economy, you know, trade to GDP, 180%, exporting, you know, a third of exports, cars are a third of its exports is Slovakia. So basically, I'm just going to show you sort of what was, how we dealt with the issue in real life, how we constructed February and March macro projections, taking the news from the U.S. administration as they arrived. Some of the basic facts about the Slovak economy, what you need to know is, you know, extremely small, open, manufacturing-oriented economy, like neighboring Czechia, very similar to Germany, cars playing a major role there. However, what is important is that there's a lot of intra-EU trade, and extra-EU trade is at only 70% of GDP, and only 4.5% of exports go to the US. Most of it is cars, but that's the situation. And actually, so when we started to hear the news about the tariffs, you know, we were like a prime example of economy that all this new tariff agenda could crush the economy and put it into recession and all of this. Assuming that, you know, the original government that was preparing all of this was pretty sort of a closed economy, US huge closed economy, and that the impact on the US would be thus very, very limited, and the impact on economies like Slovakia would be really crushing. You know, this left-hand side chart basically tells you about the car production density, you know, number of cars produced per capita. Slovakia, with the neighboring Czech Republic, basically top 1, top 2 production countries in the world. Share of employment is 7%. Destinations, as I mentioned, to the US is 10% growing. It's the reason is that actually we produce, you know, different brand names, and some of the luxury SUVs like, you know, Porsche Cayenne or Audi Q7 are produced only in Slovakia, and that's why we do have some exports to the US because there's no other production location. Basically, we were trying to make these forecasts in the early parts of this year, first in February and March. As you know, following the press conference of President Trump in early April, you know, this was the situation for the EU countries. These are effective tariff rates. Effective meaning that, you know, the original tariff level was at 20% for EU. However, it was 25% for cars, then later auto parts, and also, you know, steel and aluminum. So because of that, because, you know, Slovakia is such a car producer, the effective tax rate was the highest. And now it's even more, you know, in relative terms, higher than the average EU because, as you know, the average level was pushed down to 10% instead of 20%, but the cars are still kept at 25%. So now that you know, disadvantage of Slovakia is even greater. So we use two approaches how to compute the impact. The first one, a static exercise, so what's having the information about the global value chains, and being an EU member, we could use this Eurostat Figaro database that covers 46 countries, and in each country there are 64 sectors. So when you play with this database, you put it in a model that you can then shock. Then basically we use this input-output model to come up with the estimate of immediate, say, sort of short-run shock when the demand for cars produced in Slovakia declines. Now, okay, I don't want to go into technical details. You can then later see it in the slides. But basically, the result was, so first we decided, what sort of demand shock all these tariffs mean. We arrived at a sort of a very broad figure of 30%, so 25% on cars could represent 30%. You have certain things that are at play, price income elasticities, and of course increased costs for US domestic car producers because of steel and aluminum tariffs. So let's say it's around 30%, and we put this shock into our input-output model, and we arrived at a mere 0.3% immediate decline in Slovakia's GDP, 3.2% in terms of value added within the car sector, which also reflects the fact that only 10% of cars are exported to the US, and actually the value added for Slovakia is maybe half of the value added in that sector. For Germany, around 20%. So that was used as just a double check for the real forecasting exercise that would take into account all these dynamic effects, that of course you have general tariff levels that are pulling the global growth weaker, and you have all these indirect effects that in case of Slovakia turn out to be twice as sizable as the direct impact. So with the real forecasting exercise, we have a standard medium-sized error correction model, and we use several satellite models to fine-tune the supply-side inflation, so commodity, food prices, so forth, interest rates, fiscal policy, and also foreign demand, which in this case is very important. And we used various exogenous forecasts by ECB, regional central banks, European Commission, and so forth. Actually, the ECB made a forecast in March, headline forecast that it didn't include an increased uncertainty. It had it only as a scenario in a box. It was not part of the headline forecast, but we used that increased uncertainty to put it already in our March forecast, because for us that was sort of the most likely impact. So we compare two forecasts. The first one is as of February. You might remember that the stock market was still very bullish. It was way ahead of the 2nd of April announcement of Trump tariffs. So the commodity price is high and so forth. And then we made a March forecast, which actually we took the very first days of April into account. And you can see then the result. And this March forecast already included this dramatic negative reaction on the financial markets, especially with the commodity prices, the expectation of maybe a recession in the US, much slower global growth. And that turned out to be then important for us. When we computed this March forecast, so as of early April, we didn't put all of the negative price shock on the financial markets, but we did some smoothing. I mean, this is a sort of a especially good case for, let's say, more sort of moving average type of analysis when putting into models the new news, because this news from US administration tends to change relatively frequently. So here you can see the results, the cumulative impact of almost 2% of GDP on Slovakia. But basically, this might mean that Slovakia, instead of growing at around 2%, might grow at closer to 1%. So it would not put, hopefully, the economy into recession. As of February, when there were only tariffs announced for China and not for the EU, and also some uncertainty about Mexico, Canada tariffs, you can see this black part of the impact, and then the new Trump tariffs announced in early April is the additional blue, arriving at almost 2% impact on the GDP. Employment 0.5% fall, And what was actually very different from February to March forecast was the price inflation forecast, because the first, when we made this forecast in February, having the early parts of the tariff proposal there, the markets were still bullish. Nobody was expecting maybe a potential recession in the US or a global slowdown, and the commodity prices were relatively high. But when we took into account the reaction of the financial market, and again, we smoothed it out, so we took only half of the change, dramatic change that happened from February, bullish situation, to early April, very negative reaction of the market. But still, basically this erased, especially in 2027-28, sort of the inflation impact for Slovakia of this new tariff policy. And in terms of the cumulative impact on inflation, that's a disinflation of 0.9%. So might be, of course, one would expect relatively sizable inflation in the US, but on the other side, for a country like Slovakia, it can be disinflation because all these commodity prices are much weaker. Okay, and the very last thing that we did is that, and you can also maybe indirectly trace it to President Trump as well, even though, of course, that also, Russia plays some role in this here as well. So there is a new initiative in the EU about to increase the defense spending, and the prime example was Germany, and with the change of the debt brake and so forth. So we were wondering if the military spending would gradually increase, at rate, say, 0.2% of GDP, more or less annually, from 2% levels to 3% levels by 2029. What sort of offsetting impact this fiscal stimulus could have? So, as you might know, there is an escape clause in the new EU expenditure limits rules for this defense. So actually this creates a new fiscal space. And it depends how the government, how EU governments will react to that, whether they will really implement all of the EU. This assumes that all EU countries will implement an increase in defense spending to 3%. Slovakia, this might be the case in some other countries, but maybe not all of them. You also need to decide what part of the increase is real new defense investment, and which part is maybe that the car producers will start to produce military equipment, and maybe you would see some fiscal gimmicks like building a new hospital that would claim to be of military purpose, but it will be also open to general public and so forth. So we assume that a third of that increase would be a real one, which could tend to have a slightly greater impact on potential growth, productivity, innovation, and so forth, than just a pure sort of a transfer or increase in spending. And we assume that all of EU countries will adhere to this plan to 3%. So how big of an offset of this negative impact from tariffs you're gonna get? And this is the final outcome, is that basically around 30% of this almost 2% of GDP fall could be mitigated by increased defense spending. Most of the investment shrinkage, 2/3 of the potential employment loss could be mitigated because we have all these, the labor skills in manufacturing, producing cars, so it might not be so difficult to start to produce in manufacturing some other vehicles. What is important is that disinflation is completely removed. So because of that increase in military spending, it can have an impact on commodity markets and other prices. So we no longer have a benefit of disinflation in Slovakia. The cumulative impact is basically zero.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, would you and Seamus just change places?
Sure.
Yeah, we'll move the mic over so that we can do questions that way. And now Seamus Coffey, the head of the Irish Fiscal Council, is going to offer some reflections.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And how much time do we have?
4 minutes, please.
Shouldn't have asked the question. So we'll try and go through some key points. My presentation in total would have been linked to Jan's work on cars and tariffs, etc. But given the time constraint, we'll go through maybe some of the highlights and try to pick some issues in relation to Ireland, the impact of uncertainty and how we should treat uncertainty. And is it sort of a problem that we should seek to address and get the right answer? Or is it just something that we have to deal with, given the nature of and the fact that it arrives? So lots of pictures, good stories. I could tell you why Irish whiskey is better than Scotch whiskey, but the time has limited me on that, so we'll keep our Scottish counterparts happy. But just in terms of Ireland and looking at the importance of the US economy, this is just the share of manufacturing employment in EU countries that's in US companies. So in Ireland, 25% of those who work in manufacturing work for US companies. No other EU country comes near. Average for the EU as a whole is 4%. We are 6 times above that. So when something like this happens, it gets headline news in Ireland, just given the scale, the range, the impact, the contribution that US companies make to Ireland. When we see things like this, it's going to make headline news. So that is April 2nd, so-called Liberation Day for President Trump, when he announced his reciprocal tariffs. Although we'll put reciprocal in inverted commas, because really they were just, to all intents and purposes, made up. There was a formula that was reverse engineered to get the answers. But really it was a sort of a shot in the dark from the Trump administration to try and generate a bit of turmoil, generate a bit of uncertainty, and there's no doubt it did that. But maybe when looking at these models, this is when we begin our analysis of the uncertainty. Once the tariffs were announced on April 2nd, is that our dummy variable? Are we looking for changes after that? But from an Irish context, if we just skip forward, all these good stories are gone. We can look at some backward-looking data. Now, we're not looking backwards very far. In fact, we're looking at data that was published by Eurostat yesterday. So let's not say at the OECD meetings that we're not up to date in terms of use of data. This data is still less than 24 hours off the press. And this is year-on-year growth in GDP for selected EU countries, just the top of the Eurostat press release on GDP growth for EU countries. And one of those numbers is not like the others. It should be easy to see which one it is. One of them is in double digits. Irish GDP growth put at 11%. Q1 2025 versus Q1 2024. 11% GDP growth. For the EU as a whole, put it just over 1%. So here in Ireland, we're doing something pretty magical, or there's something distorting the numbers. And it is the latter of those, the former of those. There is something distorting the numbers. So again, just to highlight the role uncertainty plays, and that's not really once an announcement is made, it's not really after a policy comes into effect. In fact, it can be just the rumours and just the talk of policies can have an impact. So again, we'll just look at, again, freshly released data. What drove that 11% year-on-year GDP growth rate for Ireland? So this is back to the Irish Statistics Agency, who published data on trade, I think also yesterday, or perhaps even the day before. It certainly was late this week. And that is Irish trade for March 2024 versus March 2025. The top panel is exports. Total exports in Ireland in March 2025 were 94% higher than total exports in March 2024. Exports in the past month, well, March, 2 months ago, that's before April 2nd, Liberation Day, were almost double what they were the previous year. And we get a breakdown of the areas. Main trading partners for Ireland, the UK, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the rest of the EU, the rest of the world. But the bizarre number is for trade to the US. Last March, Irish exports to the US were just over 5 billion. This March, Irish exports to the US were 25 billion. If we're going to be accurate, we'll say it's 395% higher. Grew by a factor of 5. What was that based on? Rumour. What Donald Trump was going to do on April 2nd. This is data for March, before he got into the Rose Garden with his cheap bit of plastic and flashed up those so-called reciprocal tariffs. So from a modelling perspective, like what does that mean for us? Again, just looking at sort of a picture of it, this is a picture our statistics agency put out in December, which is Ireland's exports to our main trading partners. Not a whole lot going on. The US is the second from the top there. For most of that period, the EU was the main trading partner, the US is second, then we have the rest of the world, and formerly our main trading partner, Great Britain, the UK down towards the bottom. That's the largest of our main trading partners. But that was the December release of this chart. Here's the March one. 3 months later, the scale has jumped up. One of the lines is doing crazy things. And even before the announcements, we see Irish exports to the US ballooning. The companies are responding before the policy is even announced. They're tariff jumping. Get your products into the US ahead of any potential tariffs. And in the main, these are pharmaceuticals, which up to now have been excluded from the US tariffs. But this has distorted the data to no end. And in terms of our modelling, our forecasting, our reactions, like we can say, well, what happened from April 2nd on? But from an Irish Fiscal Advisory Council perspective, I don't want to know how wrong our Q1 forecast for exports was. If we did that last October, November, and based it on the previous trends, which are here, and this is what we saw in the quarter, like our forecast error, our miss for Q1 is huge. But that's just the world we live in. Like there's really not a whole lot, so that's just the US on its own, just to show what's happened. And then just to conclude, like when faced with an environment such as this, like uncertainty is a feature of the world we live in. We really can't change that. At times it is more pronounced, and it certainly is more pronounced now. So when facing it, like we have to do something. Like to quote George Box back from the mid-1970s, all models are wrong. So we could stand up and criticize models and say they didn't do this, didn't cover that, did you think of this? Every model is going to have those shortcomings. But some models are useful. So from the Slovakian perspective, to tell us that the impact of that tariff will be greater felt in the US rather than Slovakia. Maybe the net effect mightn't be that large. So when it comes to dealing with uncertainty, I think we can paraphrase Eisenhower and say that the model is nothing, but modeling is everything. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I would now ask our colleagues to, we can take 2 questions. Belgium, and does someone else want to put the tent up now? Oh, I need you to turn it slightly. Okay, Australia. All right, so Belgium, then Australia.
Thanks a lot for the 2 presenters. That was amazing and very useful because we're actually doing the same thing now in the context of the Eurosystem projection exercise, which is an update to the March one that Jan referred to. So I'm going to sort of seize the opportunity to ask a number of technical questions, if you don't mind, very brief. I was a bit surprised by the rather high impact, negative impact of the tariffs in Slovakia. I have to say I was less surprised about the volatility in Irish data because even without Trump, they don't seem to be very stable. But for Slovakia, my hunch was, and I don't know if that's right, Jan, that the price elasticity of your exports, since you said yourself those are mostly luxury cars, Porsche, SUVs and so on, would not be so high. So what did you assume there that you get such a big impact? The other thing that I was wondering about and that you didn't mention, you get a very important disinflationary impact, but if understood correctly, it mostly comes from endogenous effects from GDP and the financial markets. Did you pencil in something for trade aversion from China? That's the issue that we're now dealing with and the big unknown for this session. If the Chinese exports that were going to the US now come to Europe, then I guess the risks to the inflation outlook could be even bigger. And then I was wondering, and that's really my last question, about your final scenario where you also try to include the defense spending, which is again very highly uncertain. And so what was your assumption on import content there? Did you assume that everything would come from European production and nothing from whatever F-35s bought in the US and so on? Thanks very much.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you for the questions. So in terms of this 30% shock to demand in this input-output. There are basically three parts that are playing the role, as you say, price elasticity, which for SUVs could be greater than one, but then income elasticity, and then also the fact that actually the US, competing US car production can become more expensive following the tariffs on steel and aluminum. But that was just a guess, so I don't want to defend it too much. But it was the luxury SUV car segment that would tend to have a higher price elasticity in general. With the China, excellent remark, and I had it in the slides, but I forgot to mention it. A big disclaimer to this sort of analysis is that we don't model the impact that actually the export markets for China in the US would be closed, and with all these already produced production, this production could then get dumped in EU markets. So this is a big disclaimer that exactly could increase the disinflation. Probably there might be some political, some policy reaction that would mitigate that. We don't know, but yeah, without that, there is a danger really that the price disinflation could be much stronger. And in terms of military stimulus, I think my colleagues would just assume sort of the historical import component of the military production. But you might also be right that maybe in this new geopolitics, maybe Europe might prefer to have less of US imports here in this area. So maybe then the stimulus for EU could be slightly stronger compared to what was sort of the historical impact of increased military spending on GDP, because maybe EU would prefer to rely more on EU-produced military equipment. But of course, to some extent, it's not possible to rely only on EU, because US, of course, is in many segments might be the only producer of certain sophisticated equipment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Australia.
Thanks very much. It was a really good couple of presentations there. I had a couple of questions about the modelling exercise. The input-output sort of rule of thumb check you did explicitly ignores relative price impacts. I was wondering to what extent relative price impacts are captured within the error correction model framework that you've used, whether they be for non-US consumers or potential consumers of Slovakian exports, or for domestic consumption decisions made in the light of the deflationary impacts that it could have. And the other question I had was around the military accumulation scenario. What is your assumed capital accumulation pathway that allows you to retool into in different industries to affect that compensatory impact?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. So the first one, how we did with the error correction model. So we basically had a huge negative shock to foreign demand that we got from other institutions, and and in addition, for example, ECB had a box on just a pure uncertainty. So uncertainty and global demand shock, we put it into our model as exogenously taken from other institutions, and we just run the model. With the military path, so I did not understand exactly what was...
Sorry, so in the military scenario, you've compensated for some of the negative impacts of the tariff imposition through shifting demand into like a fiscal stimulus in accumulation of military equipment. To what extent is the Slovakian economy able to retool into that space? Because you made mention about, you have the right skill base for that kind of production.
Okay, I'm not sure if I will be answering the question, but Slovakia is sort of a special case that, being a producer of cars, it might be easy to switch into other, say, manufacturing-based military equipment. And we had certain assumptions about the labor market, that it would be relatively flexible for people to reorient into defense manufacturing. Maybe that's an advantage of Slovakia, having such a manufacturing-oriented economy.
Thank you very much. I want to offer my thanks and my apology to both our speaker and our discussant. I am grateful for such clear and interesting presentations, and I am also grateful that you retooled them on the fly to shorten them, and I apologize for the need, but I'm grateful you did it. Thank you. Please, everyone, give them a round of applause. And next, we're going to hear a lightning report from our colleagues at the OECD Secretariat. John Blantal.
Thank you very much, Mark. We are already over time, so this will be short, this report by the Secretariat. Let me just highlight, just move to the next. Yeah. Yeah, no, actually, Deborah, I was wrong. If you could go back. Thank you. Let me first of all start by highlighting the fact that there is a QR code now on the screen. This is the evaluation form for the meeting. We ask you 3 simple questions. What did you like about this meeting? What can we improve for next year's meeting? And suggestions for agenda items for the next meeting. Sherry is laughing, maybe hopefully for a good reason, but anyway. So please do the evaluation forms. They are immensely helpful for us in planning. Now back to the report by the Secretariat. In short, there are essentially 2 things that we are working on in the area of budgeting and public expenditures. One is restoring public finances, and the other is empowering public understanding. Everything that we're doing is feeding into those two things. The work on restoring public finances is, of course, how do we set countries back on a sustainable fiscal path? And the work on empowering public, please just stay on the first. I'm not going to use any other slide. And the second is on empowering public understanding, which this group is very familiar with. Those are the 2 main key strands of the work going forward. There will be a novelty next year. Many of you have been asking where next year's meeting will take place. It will take place in Paris, France, at the OECD. And the novelty of the meeting is that at the OECD we have 3 communities that focus on public finance issues. We have this group, of course. We have another group that consists of the budget directors from OECD countries. And we have a third group, which are the auditors general, the heads of supreme audit institutions from our member countries. The notion is to have them all in Paris at the same time. And we envisage this event as having 3 components. The first component is each group meeting by itself as a group, as we do. So this group would meet by itself, the budget directors by themselves, and the auditors by themselves. The second component would be to have some joint sessions where the 3 communities mix. And the third component is more of an outreach event outside our community. All of these groups have been focusing on empowering public understanding. We've been doing this very much from a supply side, although we have benefited greatly from having sessions where we bring in people, representatives from the media and other groups, but to have essentially a component dedicated more to the demand side, if you will, of this engagement function. So those 3 components together. This is all very, very exciting, I think, for all of us. And I would like to highlight, since 2 of the people that are very much involved in this work are inside this room. Eddie Casey, of course, who you know with an Irish hat, but he also now has an OECD hat for the next year and a half. He will be with us, so we are very, very grateful for that. And Geert Lankenhuis, who is sitting there with a Belgium flag. He is also an OECD consultant for restoring public finances, so we are very fortunate to have two key members from this group very much involved in this work. I would also like to highlight the tool to incorporate climate issues into long-term fiscal projections, which is one of the things that Eddie will be working on. That is of great importance, and this group is very much seen as contributing in a major way to that at the OECD. And then, of course, we do a lot of reviews and country support. We heard yesterday about the development of a joint budget office here in Chile. There are activities in many of our member countries, as you are familiar with, to enhance the capacity of parliaments to deal with budgeting issues that we are very much supportive of, and also to strengthen fiscal councils. So I will not have it any longer, Mr. Chairman, for that, but please, at any time, please contact me, contact Sherry for any further information. And if you could maybe put the QR code back on, Deborah, so people have it. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate you keeping that very short so we can get only a little bit late. I have a couple of announcements. One is this year's Asian PBO Network meeting will take place on 25-27 June in Seoul, South Korea, thanks to NABO. And we appreciate their good collaboration in hosting this regional meeting with the OECD. As John said, we hope that you'll offer suggestions for improving future work by this working party, and we hope that it has been a very helpful meeting to you, and that the opportunities for us to get together and to know each other better worked well, and that we will continue these conversations both immediately after this meeting and in the weeks, months, and years to come. I think that those connections are as important as anything that we say during the meeting. So I hope that that has all worked very well. And I thank you for your attention and compliance with my sometimes shifting directions. That has been very helpful. Most of all, I want to thank our hosts, once again, the Chilean Senate, for all that you did to make this all possible, for being tremendous leaders both in the region and in the world. Thank you. John, did you want to say one last word?
Just very quickly to add my words of thanks. Thanks to all of you for coming here. This was a very far way to come, but it was very much a very special and memorable meeting for all of us. So thank you for coming. Thank you in particular to the presenters, to the commentators, to the leaders of the discussion groups. A special thank you, of course, to our accession countries. It goes without saying, a very special thanks to Sherry for leading this work, and to Deborah there in the back, and to all of the staff here in Chile. Thank you, Raul, thank you, Paula, and all of the people who have been working in the background to make this work. I say this, you must be so happy to see us leave and enjoy your weekends and return back to normal. But thank you all so much. I think this has been a fantastic 2 or 3 days. And of course, our chairman. Thank you.
You are quite welcome. It says that I'm now adjourning the meeting, which I am, and announcing the cultural event details, but I don't have them. So, Paula, do you want to?
Okay, so we're getting ready for the cultural visit. We can maybe get people that are going to the naval base to one side, and then the walking tour here. I know that some of you guys need to leave, so maybe the ones that need to leave on the middle, so just make sure that I don't miss any of you guys. Again, I'm extending my gratitude. I know it was a far trip to come here. Thank you. It was an honor. Let's keep in touch. I'm going to bother all of you. And again, thank you so much.